Selamat datang kepada Bapak dan Ibu sekalian ke dalam webinar GRI-CDP Advanced Workshop Introduction to TCFD and SDG dengan tema hari ini mengenai Greenhouse Gas Accounting. Acara akan kami mulai pada pukul 9. Dan sebelum memulai acara, saya juga ingin menginformasikan bahwa kami telah mengadakan webinar sebelumnya pada bulan Juni, yang materinya serta rekamannya dapat Anda akses di link berikut. Jadi silakan nanti apabila Anda tertarik untuk melihat webinar-webinar sebelumnya. Selain itu, ini juga penting, saya juga ingin mengundang sebelum acara mulai agar peserta untuk mengisi daftar hadir. Jadi Anda dapat mengisi daftar hadir dengan cara men-scan QR code yang ditampilkan di layar, atau Anda juga dapat mengaksesnya melalui link yang tersedia di kolom chat box yang sudah diposting oleh rekan saya. Jadi silakan untuk Bapak Ibu peserta yang baru masuk ke acara ini, selamat datang. Jadi silahkan sebelum kita mulai acaranya untuk dapat mengisi daftar hadir. Itu bisa melalui QR code yang terdapat di layar, atau Anda juga dapat mengaksesnya melalui link yang sudah disediakan di dalam chat box oleh rekan saya. Baik, jadi acara akan saya mulai sebentar lagi, dan sambil menunggu silakan untuk mengisi daftar hadir peserta. Terima kasih. Baik, waktu sudah menunjukkan pukul 9, jadi mari kita mulai saja acara hari ini. Bapak dan Ibu sekalian, selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, dan salam sejahtera. Puji dan syukur kita panjatkan kepada Tuhan Yang Maha Esa atas rahmat-Nya kita semua dalam keadaan sehat dan juga dapat hadir dan berpartisipasi dalam webinar kita hari ini yang bertajuk TCFD Deep Dive Greenhouse Gas Emission Accounting. Sebelum kita memulai lebih jauh, berikut merupakan daftar istilah yang akan banyak kita pakai pada hari ini. Tapi jangan khawatir jika Anda tidak dapat mengingat istilah-istilah ini, nanti kami juga akan melampirkannya ke dalam dokumen setelah webinar ini berlangsung. Jadi sedikit perkenalan untuk webinar hari ini. Webinar ini bertujuan untuk memberikan wawasan yang lebih dalam terkait dengan greenhouse gas accounting. Webinar kita hari ini merupakan webinar ketiga dari seri webinar yang akan kami bawakan selama tahun 2021 melalui kemitraan dengan Global Reporting Initiative atau yang biasa kita kenal dengan GRI. Pada kesempatan ini, saya juga ingin memperkenalkan diri. Nama saya Wisnu Rizky Wibisono. Saat ini saya bekerja di CDP sebagai Sustainable Finance Engagement Manager, dan saya akan memandu jalannya webinar hari ini. Sebelum kita mulai, ada beberapa hal terkait pelaksanaan webinar yang perlu Anda ketahui. Yang pertama adalah audio untuk peserta akan di-mute selama jalannya webinar ini. Yang kedua adalah nanti akan ada sesi tanya-jawab di akhir webinar ini. Jadi bagi peserta yang memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan untuk tulis pertanyaan Anda melalui fitur Q&A selama webinar berlangsung. Nanti pertanyaan Anda akan dijawab oleh pemateri baik secara tertulis melalui Q&A box ataupun dapat dijawab secara langsung ketika sesi Q&A. Yang kedua adalah setelah itu adalah webinar ini juga akan direkam. Nanti rekaman webinar ini akan dibagikan kepada peserta yang sudah mendaftar. Nanti rekaman akan tersedia dalam 2 bahasa, yakni bahasa Indonesia dan juga bahasa Inggris. Dan materi webinar hari ini akan dibawakan dalam bahasa Inggris. Namun tenang, jangan khawatir, terjemahan langsung dalam bahasa Indonesia juga tersedia bagi peserta yang ingin mendengarkan materinya dalam bahasa Indonesia. Lalu Bagaimana untuk mengakses fitur tersebut? Jadi, bagi Anda yang ingin mendengarkan materinya dalam bahasa Indonesia, Anda dapat mengakses fitur penerjemahan langsung. Anda dapat mengklik ikon interpretation yang berada di panel bagian bawah layar Anda, dan kemudian Anda dapat memilih ikon bahasa Indonesia seperti yang Anda lihat di layar saat ini. Silahkan ikuti langkah berikut di layar untuk mengakses fitur interpretasi, dan jika Anda tidak ingin mendengarkan suara dari pemateri, Anda dapat mengklik tombol mute original audio yang Anda dapat lihat di layar. Juga bagi Anda yang menggunakan handphone, Anda juga tentu saja dapat mengakses fitur tersebut. Langkahnya seperti Anda dapat lihat di layar, itu dengan cara mengklik tombol More, kemudian Anda pilih Language Interpretation, dan tentu saja di sana silakan pilih Bahasa Indonesia. Langkah-langkahnya Anda dapat lihat seperti yang ada dalam layar saat ini. Sebelum masuk ke bahasan utama, saya akan sedikit memberikan latar belakang mengenai webinar hari ini, yang mungkin sebagian dari Anda juga sudah mendengarnya di webinar kemarin yang dibawakan oleh GRI. Jadi, proyek ini merupakan proyek peningkatan kapasitas ini dapat terlaksana melalui pendanaan dari Department of Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy Kerajaan Inggris. Dan programnya sendiri itu bernama UK-PACT, yang merupakan singkatan dari Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. Program ini merupakan bagian komitmen dari Inggris Raya dalam mengatasi isu perubahan iklim dengan bekerja dengan negara-negara mitra dan juga organisasi dalam mendukung untuk percepatan transisi ke pertumbuhan yang rendah karbon. Bersama dengan mitra kami, GRI, kami menjalankan program peningkatan kapasitas bagi perusahaan tercatat di Indonesia, khususnya untuk isu-isu terkait lingkungan, sosial, dan juga tata kelola, atau yang kita kenal dengan sebutan ESG. Dan ini kita lakukan di sepanjang tahun 2021. Dari sisi CDP, kami berfokus untuk memberikan informasi mengenai praktik terbaik global untuk aksi dan pelaporan lingkungan dalam konteks Task Force for Climate Financial Related Disclosure, atau yang kita kenal dengan TCFD. Sedangkan mitra kami, GRI, itu berfokus pada bagaimana perusahaan dapat menyelaraskan tujuan dan indikator kerja bisnisnya dengan tujuan pembangunan berkelanjutan, atau yang kita kenal dengan SDG. Jadi kami membagi lokakarya ini menjadi beberapa bagian, yaitu yang pemula atau beginner, yang mahir atau advance, dan nanti juga akan ada seri untuk pasar modal atau capital markets. Lokakarya untuk pemula telah dilaksanakan di bulan Mei, dan lokakarya untuk tingkatan mahir atau advance juga pernah diadakan di bulan Juni. Saya yakin sebagian besar dari peserta hari ini juga telah menghadiri webinar tersebut. Dan dari sisi CDP, dalam webinar pemula yang kami adakan di bulan Mei, kami telah mengenalkan mengenai Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosure, atau yang biasa kita kenal dengan singkatan TCFD. Dan apabila Anda berhalangan untuk menghadiri webinar tersebut, namun tertarik untuk belajar mengenai dasar-dasar dari TCFD, maka Anda dapat mempelajarinya melalui rekaman webinar yang ada pada slide. Yang mana nanti slide-nya ini akan kami bagikan kepada peserta setelah kegiatan ini berlangsung. Sedangkan pada lokakarya berikutnya, CDP itu berfokus pada penilaian resiko perubahan iklim dan juga analisa senario perubahan iklim. Lagi-lagi, rekaman webinar ini juga nanti dapat Anda akses melalui tautan yang ada pada slide ini, dan juga tadi kalau Anda ingat di awal, itu juga ada di YouTube-nya IDX. Selain itu, ada juga yang menarik, kami juga baru menyelesaikan penerjemahan dari beberapa bahan-bahan mengenai TCFD ke dalam bahasa Indonesia. Dan tentu saja, materi ini nanti akan kami bagikan kepada peserta melalui email setelah kegiatan berlangsung. Jadi, untuk melanjutkan tema dari webinar-webinar sebelumnya, serta atas masukan dari peserta, di sesi webinar kali ini, kami memutuskan untuk fokus pada tema Greenhouse Gas Accounting, Yang mana ini akan sangat relevan dengan perusahaan yang masih sangat awam dengan tema ini, tapi ini juga akan relevan untuk perusahaan yang sudah berpengalaman. Jadi mereka dapat mencari informasi terbaru dan juga mengetahui praktik terbaik dalam tema ini. Di sini juga sudah saya tuliskan beberapa tujuan pembelajaran untuk lokakarya hari ini atau webinar hari ini. Yang pertama adalah untuk mengenali dasar dari GHG accounting dan juga standar GHG protokol. Yang kedua adalah mengidentifikasi elemen-elemen penting dari pelaporan GHG seperti menentukan cakupan perusahaan, skop emisi, dan juga jenis data yang perlu dikumpulkan. Lalu setelah itu kita juga akan belajar melalui contoh kasus untuk memahami praktik terbaik dalam GHG accounting perusahaan dan bagaimana pendekatannya untuk berbagai jenis senario. Dan yang terakhir, tentu saja yang paling penting adalah untuk membantu perusahaan dalam mengambil langkah awal untuk memulai atau juga untuk memperbaiki GHG accounting di perusahaan Anda. Dan sebelum saya masuk ke agenda hari ini, sekali lagi saya ingin mengucapkan terima kasih bagi para peserta dan pembicara yang telah bergabung dalam webinar hari ini. Selain itu, saya juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih sebesar-besarnya kepada UK PACT Green Recovery Fund dan juga mitra kami, Global Reporting Initiative, serta Kementerian Perencanaan Pembangunan Nasional atau BAPPENAS, Kedutaan Besar Inggris di Jakarta, PT Bursa Efek Indonesia, dan juga Indonesia Corporate Secretary Association yang telah memberikan dukungan dalam pengembangan dan juga pelaksanaan proyek ini. Jadi berikut merupakan agenda hari ini. Jadi sesi webinar ini akan berdurasi sekitar 2,5 jam, dan kita juga akan memiliki jeda untuk coffee break di tengah-tengah agenda tersebut. Jadi pertama, untuk webinar hari ini akan diisi oleh Mr. Matt Sprague dari South Pole, yang mana nanti akan sekitar 2 jam akan memberikan pelatihan mengenai greenhouse gas accounting untuk perusahaan. Jadi sekali lagi, apabila Anda memiliki pertanyaan selama sesi tersebut, silahkan ajukan pertanyaan Anda dalam Q&A box. Setelah sesi tersebut, kegiatan berikutnya akan dilanjutkan dengan pemaparan dari Bapak Olivier Tichit dari PT Musimas, yang akan membagikan ilmunya serta pengalamannya mengenai greenhouse gas accounting dalam konteks perusahaan. Baik, sebelum saya memulai, saya ingin sedikit memperkenalkan mengenai Mr. Matt Sprague. Jadi, Mr. Matt Sprague ini merupakan Associate Director di South Pole. Beliau merupakan ahli dalam bidang energi dan juga dekarbonisasi, dan saat ini beliau memimpin jasa konsultasi untuk klien South Pole di Australia dan juga di Asia. Selain itu, Mr. Matt juga memiliki fokus untuk mendukung kliennya dalam tema greenhouse gas accounting dan juga dalam menyusun kerangka dekarbonisasi dengan tujuan untuk membantu kliennya menuju keberlanjutan dan juga untuk mencapai ambisi net zero. Dengan latar belakangnya dalam project management serta kualifikasi formal dalam teknik kimia, manajemen energi dan karbon serta energi terbarukan, Mr. Matt menilai dan mengidentifikasi peluang dalam proyek dekarbonisasi dan juga proyek penghematan energi mulai dari tahap awal hingga pengukuran dan juga verifikasi setelah implementasi proyek berjalan. Baik, mungkin itu sedikit pengenalan mengenai pembicara pertama kita hari ini. Jadi baik, mari kita undang saja Pak Matt Sprague. So we are very pleased to be joined by Matt today. I've briefly introduced your bio. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Vishnu. Hi, everybody. Let me just try and share my screen. Okay, can we see this? Is that showing? Perfect. Okay, it's nice to be speaking to you all today. I won't go through this. Vishnu gave me a very kind introduction already. But yes, I represent South Pole within the Asia Pacific region, working everything from greenhouse gas accounting through to target setting and net zero strategy work as well. So today we're going to go through 2 sessions. The first session is giving an overview of greenhouse gas accounting, providing some background to greenhouse gas accounting, the benefits of doing that work, and then providing a brief overview of the greenhouse gas protocol. And then in the second session after the break, we'll be going through greenhouse gas accounting processes for businesses. So looking at the process and the accounting for business purposes, how to define boundaries, emission scopes, and looking at a little bit more detail on data collection. We'll give you an example and a case study on a greenhouse gas report and best practice for reporting your emissions, some common challenges that we see in a number of our clients, and then we'll be ending on a couple of case studies to put it into context. So in session 1, we'll be running through an overview of greenhouse gas accounting. So we'll be running through greenhouse gas accounting in a nutshell, the greenhouse gas protocol standards, and then we'll be ending with a Q&A session at the end. So just to introduce you to South Pole, we are a profit for purpose company, 15 years old, founded in 2006. Our head office is in Zurich, but actually some of our first project work was in Southeast Asia, in Jakarta and Bangkok, with 2 of our first offices outside of Europe, founded way back in the early 2000s. We are a project developer initially. We've developed over 900 projects globally, but over the last 15 years, we've now grown into providing consulting and other advisory services around climate solutions, including climate risk, carbon greenhouse gas accounting, and then carbon reduction strategies through the Science Based Target Initiative, and also through now more and more so net zero. And our climate solutions team, which is where I sit within the business, we provide strategic advisory to guide decision making. We've got a renewable energy team to aid clients in purchasing renewable energy, doing footprinting and life cycle analysis. So this is what we're talking about today, greenhouse gas footprinting, project development, as I mentioned, building carbon emission reduction projects, understanding climate risk through TCFD and other platforms. And then finally, our funds and platforms helps large corporations invest in climate action. This number is constantly changing, but currently we have over 550 employees. I think it could be more than 600 early next year in over 28 offices, locations around the world. So we've got a broad mix of engineers, consultants, scientists, project developers, and finance experts as well. So helping companies go along the whole of their climate journey. So a very high level overview of some of the work we've done. We've supported over 140,000 gigawatt hours of renewable energy being generated, which is equivalent to taking 21 million cars off the road. And our projects have supported over 170 million tons of carbon dioxide being removed and reduced. We've worked on over 1,000 carbon projects in over 50 countries, created over 100,000 jobs, and protected over 2 million hectares of forests. And from the financial side, we've screened over $2 trillion of investments for climate risk and looked at investing $15 billion in advanced renewable energy projects. So I mentioned the climate journey, and this is an overview of the South Pole's climate journey, which we help organizations go through. Step 1 is to measure footprints and risks. And that's where we're talking today about greenhouse gas accounting and carbon footprinting. And that's also understanding your risks through TCFD and other climate risks as well. Secondly, it's setting roadmaps and creating targets. So setting science-based targets and net zero targets. That might also include carbon neutral or climate neutral targets and renewable energy targets as well. Thirdly, we look at reducing the footprint through supporting in purchasing renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency, and also, and more importantly, becoming more important, is decarbonizing your supply chain as well. The 4th step is financing climate action. So that's either through the purchase of carbon credits or through other funds and platforms where people can invest to support climate action. And lastly, but by no means least, is communicating and lead. So supporting our clients in communicating their targets, their successes, and their challenges along the way. So today we're going to focus on step 1, which is measuring your footprint. So in this next section, we're going to run over some of the reasons to do greenhouse gas accounting and the benefits that they can give businesses. So we all know that this is a global issue. So on the graph on the left, we've got some of the key Asian carbon dioxide emissions increase percentage by nation over the last 25 years. Indonesia's the red line. So it's similar to the Asian average and the Thai increase of around 180% over the last 25 years. At the top, we have China, which is closer to 250%, 300%, and also India has had a massive increase over the last 2 decades. On a global level, we're now seeing carbon emissions at around 35 billion tons with a B, billion tons a year, which has increased from about 25 billion tons about 20 years ago. So we've had massive increases over the last 2 or 3 decades, and we now have 10 years to halve those emissions to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. So we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050 to have a good chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is where most climate scientists say we need to achieve to mitigate the worst effects. Current global targets are looking at more than 2.5 to 3 degrees, or even 3.5 degree warming from pre-industrial levels. To give you a snapshot on Indonesia's emissions, as I mentioned, Indonesia rose more than 250% between 1990 and now, with the highest increase being in the energy sector. Surface temperatures are increasing between 0.2 and 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. And the Indonesia's target of 29% below business as usual in 2030 is not in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. And in 2019, Indonesia was estimated to be around 3.4% of the world total carbon emissions. So it sounds like a small percentage, but in terms of absolute emissions, it's pretty significant. So to give you a very quick overview of climate change 101 on one slide. So everything we do, everything we drive, all the cars we drive, all the airplanes we fly, everything we eat, make, throw away is important, and they all produce carbon dioxide emissions. And these emissions trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, which warm the planet. And over time, this warming increases the energy level in the atmosphere, which leads to some of the increased extreme weather events we've seen, and also the warming. So a breakdown of Indonesia's emissions in 2018, 43% was from land use change and forestry, or lulukuf. So that's the majority of the emissions. 35% from the energy sector, 12% from agriculture, 8% from waste, and then smaller, but by no means nothing, is from industry with 2%. So understanding the sources of emissions can also help us identify some of the opportunities to reduce those emissions over time. So now we're going to run through greenhouse gas accounting in a nutshell. This slide shows some of the key events in greenhouse gas emissions history. In 1990, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, apologize, it's always a mouthful, the IPCC, in 1990 released their first assessment report, showing the state of the climate and how we needed to reduce emissions to avoid climate change. And that led to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which saw the first time where governments joined together to set carbon targets and carbon reductions and hold themselves accountable to reducing emissions. We're just about to finish the Kyoto Protocol period and transition into the Paris Agreement. which was formed in 2015, where we saw pretty much all nations globally pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to limit global warming to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an ambition to limit that to 1.5. Other notable events over the last 3 decades: in 2000, the CDP was formed. 2001, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was published, and that sets the benchmark and best practice for accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. 2006, as I mentioned, South Pole was formed, and then in 2015, the Science Based Targets Initiative was launched to provide common understanding of decarbonisation requirements to limit global warming. This year, we saw the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which really put climate change into focus and started to say this was the decade where we need to halve emissions, or we'll be in significant risk of extreme weather events. So 4 applicable programs and standards which most people are now working to is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we'll spend a little bit more time on the GHG protocol in the following slides. But this establishes a comprehensive global framework to measure and account for greenhouse gas emissions across both the private and public sector. The Science Based Target Initiative provides clearly defined pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with science, and they're considered science-based targets if they now align with a 1.5-degree trajectory or net zero by 2050. ISO 1464-1 is also an international standard for quantifying and reporting greenhouse gas emissions, and this can be used for products and services under a life cycle assessment as well. And finally, whilst it's not a standard, but is becoming more and more common, is net zero. So the Science Based Target Initiative recently released their corporate guidance for net zero, and net zero is defined as when emissions are reduced and anthropogenic or human-induced carbon emissions are balanced globally by carbon removals. So by 2050, we need to have reduced absolute emissions by 90%, with carbon offsets being removal credits, so emissions being removed from the atmosphere to meet the final 10% of our net zero journey. So here we have 5 general reasons for doing greenhouse gas accounting, and they help support business goals as well. So the first reason is to manage your greenhouse gas risks and identify reduction opportunities. This is a good example of what you measure you can manage, but it helps identify the risks both from a financial position and also from an impact of climate position. It helps you identify cost-effective reduction opportunities. So understanding the source of the emissions can help inform which projects can be implemented to reduce those emissions. It can help you set greenhouse gas targets, science-based targets, for example, and help measure and monitor your progress towards meeting those targets. Doing greenhouse gas accounting supports public reporting and also participation in voluntary greenhouse gas programs. So a lot of the time, these voluntary programs require reporting, such as CDP, and NGOs and governments are now looking to include reporting in their greenhouse gas registries. It can also help with eco-labeling, climate neutral labeling, and greenhouse gas certification. It is often required for participation in mandatory reporting programs at a national, regional, or local level. And then it allows you to participate in the greenhouse gas market. So this is either through creation or purchase of carbon offsets, trading through cap and trade programs, and also understanding your risk of your exposure to carbon taxes and greenhouse gas taxes. And I'm sure you've seen the news, but Indonesia has just introduced its first carbon tax I believe, on the energy sector. So there is becoming more and more reason to understand your exposure to these programs. And there's recognition for early voluntary action. So understanding your greenhouse gas emissions profile and publicly announcing it can help people with their marketing and communication support around sustainability in general. So this next section, we're going to run through a little bit on the greenhouse gas protocol, and in the next section, we're going to go through in a bit more detail. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol was launched in 1998 by the World Resources Institute and also the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a multi-stakeholder partnership of businesses, NGOs, governments, and others, and it sets the standard that's most widely used for accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, and it helps people understand how to measure, manage, and report. This is the benchmark that we use at South Pole to calculate greenhouse gas emissions for all of our clients. It has 5 key principles, and these are very important to understand and follow to make sure that your emissions baseline is robust and can be relied upon in future years. So the first is relevance. So to ensure your greenhouse gas inventory reflects the greenhouse gas emissions of your company and serves the decision-making needs of others, of users. So it needs to include the emissions which are applicable to your company. The report needs to be detailed and show where these emissions are coming from to be able to support emission reduction opportunity identification and also to stand your progress over time. It needs to be complete. So it needs to account for and report all greenhouse gas emission sources and activities within your chosen inventory boundary. And we'll come on to boundaries in the next session. But what this is saying is that we need to include all relevant emission sources and not exclude anything just because either the data is not there or it's too hard to collect. It's really important to make sure that it is complete. It needs to be consistent. So we need to follow consistent methodologies to allow meaningful comparison over time. And when you report on the greenhouse gas inventory, that needs to be documented transparently so that over time you can understand why emissions are changing, whether it's through business growth, mergers and acquisitions, changes in calculation methodologies, changes in boundaries, or any changes to relevant emissions factors. It needs to be transparent. As I mentioned, it needs to include all of the information in the report for internal stakeholders and external stakeholders to understand the methodology that you used, the data sources that were used in the accounting, and also any assumptions or gaps that were identified. It also needs to be accurate. So it should be systematic and neither over or under calculate the emissions. So where there are gaps and holes in data, the assumptions and modeling that need to go in to close those gaps need to be reasonable. They can't be overestimating or underestimating. And then as far as possible, we need to remove uncertainty. And this helps over time to understand that emission reduction is real and it's not just changing in assumptions. So we'll go into a little bit more detail around different emission scopes. This slide clearly shows that the greenhouse gas protocol includes all emission sources across your business. So it breaks it down into 3 scopes. Scope 1, which is direct emissions, which occur in your office, on your site, or at your facility. Scope 2, which is electricity purchased from the grid. And then Scope 3 are supply chain or value chain emissions. And we need to consider all of these different categories and assess if they are relevant and material to your operations. So there's 3 types of greenhouse gas accounting, which are all undertaken for different reasons. Firstly, there's entity or company level, organization level greenhouse gas accounting. So this looks at all emission sources across the entire organization's operations. They have already occurred, so it's a historic look back over typically a 12-month time period to understand the activities and the emissions that actually occurred. And then over time, as you repeat that greenhouse gas accounting, you can compare your emissions this year with the emissions calculated last year to show progress towards your targets. Secondly is a project level greenhouse gas account. So this looks at avoided emissions from projects. So we look at estimating what project would emit if it was based on standard engineering design or standard product design. And then through clever or tailored design, we identify emission reduction opportunities in that project and calculate the actual emissions through implementation. And we should be able to show the emissions reduction against the estimated baseline. And thirdly, we have a product level greenhouse gas account. So this is based on a carbon life cycle assessment, or an LCA, and it combines data from past and future emissions across all phases of individual products or services. So this looks at the product from raw materials, production, transportation, use, and when it goes to landfill or is recycled. And we can compare the emissions data with prior base years as well to show if products are increasing or decreasing in carbon intensity over time. Now, when we talk about carbon footprints, a carbon inventory or a greenhouse gas inventory, it is the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted over time, measured in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So everything we do, the electricity we use, the airplanes we fly, the cars we drive, the materials that go into our products, all the food, clothing, anything that we purchase, and then everything that goes to waste as well, contributes greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We use carbon dioxide as the base level, so it has an emissions factor of 1, but other gases also contribute to climate change. For example, methane, or CH4, through fugitive emissions from coal mining or leaks from natural gas pipes. Sulfur hexafluoride, or SF6, is quite often used in high voltage switchgear, and these other gases all contribute, a big one being HFCs from refrigeration plants. So when we calculate all of the gases that are released, they each have their own emissions factor, and so we use those to calculate what's known as the carbon dioxide equivalent. The difference between an emissions factor and a global warming potential. So the global warming potential is how much a greenhouse contributes to global warming relative to carbon dioxide. So I said carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. For example, methane is 21. So methane is 21 times worse than carbon dioxide for global warming. And sulfur hexafluoride is 24,000 times worse. So 1 ton of sulfur of SF6 is equivalent to 24,000 tons of carbon dioxide. So we use global warming potentials to convert into carbon. Emission factors are very similar to global warming potentials, but they use slightly different units. So with global warming potential, we use the 6 gases identified here. However, emissions factors can be based on kilograms, liters, or dollar spend as well. So it can be applied to different value of emissions. Emissions factors are published by different organizations and can be publicly accessed as well. So this next section, we're going to answer some questions. This session was slightly shorter and the next session will be slightly longer. So I think now would be a good time to answer any questions. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much, Matt, for your very insightful training on and the overview of the greenhouse gas accounting. So now I'll be transitioning to bahasa. Jadi tadi kita sudah melewati sesi pertama dari training dari Pak Matt, dan nanti setelah ini kita akan masuk dulu sekarang ke Q&A. Ini saya lihat sebelum kita melanjutkan pelatihan ya ke sesi berikutnya, kita akan ada sesi Q&A sekitar 10 menit dan juga coffee break nanti sekitar 10 menit. Jadi sekarang kita masuk saja ke sesi tanya jawab. Ya, jadi kalau tadi kita sudah mendengarkan pemaparan dari Matt, kalau masih ada yang ingin menanyakan, silakan sekarang silakan menanyakan di kolom Q&A. Dan di sini saya juga sudah melihat ada pertanyaan baik yang masuk ke kolom Q&A ataupun masih ada juga ini yang mengirimkan ke saya secara langsung. Jadi saya akan masuk ke pertanyaan pertama. So Matt, as you've seen on the Q&A box, there's a very interesting questions on the changes to assumption. So if there is changes to assumption, how do company usually report emissions in order to be consistent? Is it similar to financial accounting, where you have to elaborate the difference on the notes, or is there another specific practices? So please feel free to answer it, and please kind of slow down a bit so our interpreter could also catch up to your sentence. Thank you, Matt.
Okay, sorry, I will talk slower. It's a great question, so thank you. Yes, so when you do an updated report and there's a change in assumption, then you should note it in that report. The only difference here is around setting setting your baseline. So if an assumption changes your baseline, which is a year in time, so for example 2020, that's where you set targets from, your baseline year. So if the assumption changes your baseline, you might need to go back and recalculate that baseline to make sure that the targets are still applicable or need to be changed. But I think it depends how big the assumption is. If it's a minor adjustment, then maybe it's not necessary. If it's big, as in more than 5% or 10% of the total emission change, then you would need to reassess your baseline as well.
Yep. Thank you, Matt. And I think there's a follow-up questions to that as well, which is also, I think it relates to netting. So if a company has emission, but at the same time it captures emission in the production system, how does it relate? Does this reduce the company emission, or is there another different accounting to this?
Okay, that's a challenging question. It's a good question. It's not an easy answer. We go into it in the next session, but essentially you need to report both. You need to report the emissions that you release and then the emissions that are captured in the product as separate numbers. So this talks about insetting. So it's the term of insetting, where you reduce emissions within your organization or your value chain without creating carbon offsets. However, there's currently the Science Based Target Initiative does not recognize that presently. They might change that methodology over time, but really you need to account for the emissions that you do generate, and then by all means take credit for the emissions that you reduce, but they need to be shown separately.
Thank you, Matt. I have a lot of questions coming to me directly as well, but I'm going to ask the question that is on the Q&A box.
Right.
So there's a question, I think you also have alluded this as well during your presentation, but there's a specific question. Is there a standard for GHG accounting for electricity and solar?
Yes, so it would still be the greenhouse gas protocol, would be the framework. So when you're looking at electricity purchased from the grid, there are two different methods. One's the market-based method and one's the location-based method, but essentially they're very similar. So we look at the kilowatt hours or the megawatt hours purchased from the grid and apply the grid emissions intensity per kilowatt hour to that number to calculate emissions from the grid. Typically, it depends on, I'm not totally sure on Indonesia's setup around behind the meter solar, but effectively behind the meter solar projects have an emissions factor of 0 because it is from renewable sources. The embedded emissions, for example, in the panels and the structure should be accounted for separately.
Yep, there's still new questions coming in. So I think this is also a very practical questions for companies. So in regards to emission reduction commitment, what do you think is the best way for companies to select their best year to do the accounting for the first time. So yeah, it's a question about the setting the base year.
Great question. Thank you, Chandra. There's a few elements to selecting a good base year. I think firstly, you need to have data available. Typically, we would recommend to do the most recent 12-month period. However, with COVID pandemic, we also want to pick a base year that is representative of normal operations. So people are maybe looking a couple of years back to understand what their normal emissions would be, but you don't want to go too far back in time. So no more than, I would say, 3 years historically, because you want to make sure that it is still relevant to your operations. But I think anywhere between 2018 and 2021 is fine, as long as there is good data and it represents your current business.
Yep. So there's also another interesting questions again in the Q&A column. Since just now you mentioned about one of the about land use change, there's a question from the palm oil industry. The question is related to the GHG calculation methods. How do you consider calculating land use change, and how much does it influence it? So basically, how do you calculate land use change and the GHG accounting, and how much influence does it have?
So I'm not an expert in land use change, unfortunately. We have a team called our agricultural value chain team, which work a lot more on agriculture and land use. But essentially, it's the emissions released or that would have otherwise been captured from the land before you cultivated it and turned it into palm oil crops, compared to the ongoing emission reduction that would be involved in the palm oil process. So yeah, it can be very significant. I think the slide we showed earlier, that 43% of Indonesia's emissions were from land use change. So it can be very significant. It's the same in Australia. About 6 or 7 years ago, we had huge emissions from land use change, which has been reduced quite significantly. So yeah, it can have a very large contribution.
Thank you, Matt. I also have some question coming to me directly. So there's an interesting question on the trends. So what are you seeing? What trends are you seeing around GHG accounting and carbon neutrality? Do you see any interesting trends for GHG accounting, especially for carbon neutrality right now?
Yeah, I think the main trend is the number of people that are starting. So people are starting to do their first greenhouse gas accounting. It's year on year, the numbers are growing. It's becoming more of a standard requirement for businesses to understand their emissions and to set reduction targets. The other thing that we're seeing basically across the board, and we'll come on to this in a later date, is that nobody has complete data. So I think most people are starting on the journey with medium to poor data quality and trying to improve that over time as well. So it's becoming less of an excuse to not start because you don't have the right data. It's more important to just start and then identify what data you do have. In terms of science-based targets, the people signing up to net zero commitments, science-based targets is increasing, exponentially year on year. So it's becoming more and more common to see large organizations and now smaller and smaller and more diversified organizations setting pretty ambitious targets.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that just now that you mentioned the key is to just start first. That's also the objective of this training today, just start first. And then the second one is data. You highlighted on data, which I think that is also a very important. Just to start on the journey, one of the first thing that a company needs, what I take from you is the need for data. So just now I also mentioned about carbon neutrality. So there's also a question coming to me about what is actually the difference between carbon neutral and also net zero carbon, because we've heard these terms being thrown a lot right now, but what does it mean actually? What's the difference?
Very important. That's common. We get a lot of confusion between carbon neutral and net zero, and people are claiming net zero when they mean carbon neutral, and it is important and it is different. So carbon neutrality looks back over the last 12 months. You do your greenhouse gas accounting today, and you go out and you purchase offsets against that volume, you retire the offsets, and you are carbon neutral. So it's a historical look back over the last 12 months, and it's an activity that you could go out and do today. Net zero is a forward-looking target to do actual decarbonization over time. So you go back, you work out your greenhouse gas accounting, just like you would do for carbon neutrality, but then you need to reduce those emissions, not through the use of offsets, but through actual projects, either through renewable energy purchasing, be that on-site or from the grid, electrification projects, energy efficiency, those types of projects, and looking across your supply chain as well. And the Science-Based Target Initiative definition is looking at least a 90% decarbonization across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, and then using carbon offsets and specifically carbon removal credits, either through nature-based projects, so forestry projects, or through technological carbon removals to neutralize the remaining 10% of your emissions. And that has to be done by 2050, but typically we're seeing, 2050 is the last, but I think 2030 is one of the earliest years that people are setting. I think South Pole's just set our 2030 target for net zero. So that's a big challenge, and it's work that's going forwards into time. So it is very important that people understand the difference, the level of effort required for both.
So there's still a lot of questions coming, which I think this is, which shows that this is a very interesting and relevant questions theme for the companies joining in today. So I have another question here, which is quite interesting, since just now we are talking mostly about companies specifically working around greenhouse gas emission, but there's a question around financial institutions. So there's a question about bank. How does a bank or other financial institution track their emission from their client? Because just now you were talking more about direct emissions on companies, but how about banks and financial institutions, which we know that mostly they have a lot of portfolio, and then which one is important? Is it the direct emission that they have, or is it also important for them to see whether to check on their emission for their portfolio?
All right, I'm just trying to get to the slide. So this is the slide. So you can see down the bottom, the last one on the bottom right is investments. So this is very applicable to all financial institutions. So understanding your financed emissions is part of your scope, is part of your emissions profile. And the CDP recently released a report that said for those financial institutions that do report their financed emissions, typically, on average, it's 700 times greater than the operational emissions. So everything else on the screen. So understanding your financed emissions is key for financial institutions. That's banks, pension funds, asset managers, those types of people, to understand their actual emissions profile and set credible targets. And so a net zero target for a bank would include net zero across their financed portfolio. And so to reduce emissions in that sector requires a lot of engagement with clients, supporting them through their net zero journeys as well, and it's not just through divestment. So we need to support lenders and investors to understand the opportunities and requirements for financial sector as well.
So yeah, really interesting to hear it from you, because just now you highlighted that the portfolio or the scope 3 of banks is very important for them to reach their net zero. So
absolutely.
I have a question in the Q&A box, which in Bahasa, so I'll try to translate it to you. So there's a question from a company so they are working, so their electricity that they source, they have 2 different sources. So the first one is they are using hybrid source. They mentioned the first one, they use a green energy, which they say that the source is from hydropower. And at the same time, their other power is using non-green energy, which they mention as gas energy, steam energy. So do you have any insights on how to calculate this kind, of using 2 sources of emission, which the first one is green, and the second one is we consider it as not green? And yeah, I think that's the question for this one.
So I would take the assumption that they are purchasing electricity off the grid in both situations.
They mentioned that it's from the grid, from the state electricity.
Okay, perfect. So the portion of electricity that comes from the hydro has an emissions factor of 0. And the proportion of electricity that comes from the gas fired generator, the gas turbine, that would have its applicable emissions factor. So depending on the emissions, the energy efficiency of that gas turbine, whether it's open cycle or closed cycle, or if it's just a mix, it would have a corresponding emissions factor. So you'd understand the kilowatt hours of electricity consumed and the kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour generated from the gas turbine, and apply the 2. And the other thing to consider is the line losses. So when you're purchasing electricity from the grid, that's scope 2 emissions, but the fuel and energy related is all the losses in the system that's not within the power station. So all the line losses would go into scope 3. So it depends. Yeah, it depends is the answer. We'd have to go and take a bit of a closer look, but that's generally how it's applied under a market-based mechanism.
So just now I highlighted the word proportion, right? And also the details of how they implement it. So I have another very interesting question right now, in which I think this is also right now a global trend right now, which is on NBS, nature-based solution. And since also we're talking a bit about carbon offset just now, so could you please provide a bit of your insights on what is the requirement of nature-based solution, or NBS, to be recognized as a carbon offset?
Yeah, no problem. I was presenting on this the other day, so I'll try and remember the categories, but it needs to be real.
Yeah.
So the project needs to have happened. It needs to be additional. So you need to show that without the revenue from the carbon credit, the project would not have occurred. So either the trees would not have been planted, or the trees would have been chopped down without the credits from the carbon. It needs to be verifiable, so it needs to be audited. It needs to be, there's 2 or 3 more categories as well, but the main one is additional. So you need to prove that without the revenue, that project would not have occurred for it to be recognized as a carbon offset. There's a number of carbon standard agencies, Gold Standard, Vera. In Australia, we've got the Emission Reduction Fund and the Clean Energy Regulator that do certification of offset projects. So I think understanding their requirements for offsets would be very important for developers.
Yep. Just now I highlighted some of your point, which is the first one, which is additionality, and the second one is verification.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we've almost reached our time for this session. So we're going to have around 5 to 7 minute breaks. So let's reconvene at my time is 10 past 5. Jadi untuk para peserta, sekarang mari kita ambil sesi coffee break terlebih dahulu. Jadi kita bisa break sekitar 5 sampai 7 menit. Jadi kalau di jam saya sekarang jam 9:59, kita silakan berkumpul kembali di jam 10:05. Jadi silakan untuk menggunakan sesi ini untuk mengambil minum, istirahat sejenak, ngecek email, atau kalau Anda ingin ke WC terlebih dahulu. Jadi silakan untuk mengambil sesi coffee break ini, dan jangan lupa untuk kembali di jam 10:05. Baik. Dan kita nanti akan lanjut lagi dengan Matt. So, thank you and have a good coffee break. Baik, selamat datang kembali para peserta. Waktu sudah menunjukkan pukul 10:05. Dan sekali lagi saya ucapkan selamat datang kembali kepada para peserta webinar di sesi kedua hari ini. Dan sekarang kita akan lanjutkan saja pelatihan kita mengenai JG Accounting dengan pemateri kita Mr. Matt Sprague. Jadi jangan lupa nanti juga setelah sesi Mr. Matt Sprague setelah ini itu akan ada sesi tanya jawab lagi. Jadi bagi Anda yang nanti di tengah-tengah training itu memiliki pertanyaan, silahkan Anda cantumkan atau Anda tanyakan saja di Q&A box. Nanti selama itu juga akan mulai saya pilih pertanyaan-pertanyaan untuk diajukan kepada Mr. Matt Sprague. Baik, mari kita mulai saja. So Matt, we will continue our training from where we left off before, and now I'll hand it over to you. So Matt, please go ahead.
Thanks, Vishnu. Let me share my screen again. So is that working?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this second session, we'll be running through greenhouse gas accounting process for businesses. We'll be looking at defining organizational boundaries and scopes, some insights on data collection, how to report greenhouse gas emissions, and following on, we will have some case studies. So there are 4 general steps to greenhouse gas accounting. The first is defining the scope. So this involves setting boundaries and determining the approach that your company will take. Secondly is going to collect the data. And thirdly, it's doing the greenhouse gas accounting itself. And finally, reporting the results. So as we mentioned earlier, the data collection can be the biggest part of this work, to find the different data owners within the organization and how to understand what activities and what emission sources are relevant to your organization or product. So these next couple of slides, we're going to talk about defining organizational boundaries. And so why are understanding your organizational boundaries so important? Well, we need to make sure that all of the emission sources that are relevant to your operation are included. So understanding how your business is structured will be the first step in understanding what needs to be included and what can be excluded. Now, a lot of businesses can be highly complex, including subsidiaries, joint ventures, franchises, and suppliers. And there are 2 main approaches to setting organizational boundaries. The first is an equity shares approach. So under this approach, it's the percentage ownership in a company that the reporting company includes. So if in 25% of a subsidiary or a joint venture, then you include 25% of that subsidiaries or that joint venture's emissions in your total footprint. This involves understanding the total emissions from that company and your share of it. Under a control approach, so this accounts for 100% all of the greenhouse gas emissions from operations over which it has control. And it accounts for none of the emissions for which it does not control. And control can be defined as financial control or operational control. So if you have control over what policies are set, what the company purchases, how they operate, then you should include 100% of those emissions. And once that emissions boundary is selected in the baseline year, it needs to be applied consistently across the entire organization and ongoing reports. When we look at operational boundaries, this is now talking about what emission scopes should be included within the calculation. And we break it down into different scopes. So we have direct emissions, which are from sources owned or controlled by the reporting company. And here we have examples such as natural gas used in boilers. liquid fuels that are used in cars, or refrigerant leaks from heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. And then secondly, we have indirect emissions. So these are a consequence of your activities, but they don't occur at sites that are owned or controlled by you. This is further broken down into scope 2, where scope 2 includes grid electricity and also purchased heat and cooling. And scope 3 is known as supply chain or value chain emissions. And as we showed earlier, this includes the rest of the services, products, investments, waste that you don't control, but are contributed to your operations. So in these next slides, we'll look at which scopes to include in your greenhouse gas account. So we need to ensure that the greenhouse gas scope is complete, and it depends on the company and type of accounting that it's done. So either it's a corporate or an organizational footprint, a project footprint, or product footprint. These approaches apply to all three types of accounting. So the inventory needs to include all the relevant emission sources. So across all three scopes and all the 15 categories of scope 3, if that emission source is relevant and is applicable to your organization, it should be included. There's a materiality threshold, where some categories may be omitted because they make up a small percentage of the total emissions, typically less than 1%, up to a maximum of 5%, which is saying that we need to account for over 25% of all the emissions in the organization. And then all material sources need to be compensated. To achieve carbon neutrality, this is the number of offsets you need to include. So this is ideal greenhouse gas accounting. So we've got a couple of examples here that show across a different sector value chain, some of the challenges and some of the opportunities for greenhouse gas accounting. For this example, we've got a product footprint in the fashion and textile industry. Now, you can consider raw material production and processing, textile and garment manufacturing as part of the upstream element of the supply chain. So we talk about upstream and downstream supply chains. So upstream is anything that happens before it reaches your organization. In this case, a garment or a piece of clothing reaches your operation. And then downstream is when it leaves your warehouse or your shop. There's a lot of energy and a lot of emissions and water that goes into producing clothing. And you need to understand all of those emission sources throughout the life cycle, from raw material through to when the piece of clothing goes to landfill. Operational emissions from offices, retail and distribution centers, as well as disposal, need to be included in the downstream portion of the supply chain. In the case of an organization, you should consider the offices and retail phase of the supply chain and identify any activity data associated directly with your staff for business operations purposes. So that means that any of the head offices, any of the employee commuting and business travel across the entire organization need to be accounted for. However, if we're just looking at a product, those can be excluded from the footprint of the product. So for the fashion industry, a large element is understanding the end of life, or when that material goes to landfill. And reducing landfill of material, as well as improved processing and production practices, are key to reducing emissions across the fashion industry. This next slide, we look at the agriculture and food industry. And here we again have the upstream process, the present, and the downstream processing as well. So like fashion, agriculture and food needs to understand the full life cycle. However, the types of data that you need to capture are different. In this case, we need to understand the type of crop, the number of crops planted, and then also the transportation of the crops. The present is your processing plant or your factory, and the energy consumed in processing those crops into the food product, and then also emissions of the company outside of that factory, such as the office. And then downstream is again the transportation of the finished food product, the consumption and the emissions associated with consuming that product, or further processing it into additional products, and then disposal. So in the case of food, consumption is normally nothing unless you sell a product like, for example, chocolate or coffee that need to be then processed into, for example, roasted coffee beans, eventually a shot of espresso, or in the case of chocolate, maybe it's melted and produced into cakes. So understanding the full value chain is important. And in addition to that is the packaging, which can be a significant impact on the environment, whether through its disposal of plastic waste or the emissions associated with paper products going to landfill. And this third example, we look at the tourism and aviation sector. So we have an example of a tour operator looking at their emissions across their operations. Obviously, air travel has huge impacts on global emissions. And to calculate for that part of the tour, we need to understand the number of flights, the classes of seating, economy, business, or first class, because they have different emissions associated with them, and also distances. So understanding the origin and destination of flights is important to be able to calculate emissions from air travel. Similar to that, we have hotels and accommodation, where we need to understand the number of rooms occupied and the number of nights, the hotel rating, be it a 5-star hotel, a 3-star hotel, because again, they have different energy and emissions ratings, and also the location. Understanding the location is important because then we can apply appropriate emissions factors for that country or that city. And finally, in this sector, we need to understand the food and beverages. So here we look at the number of meals consumed, the types of meals, whether it's lunch, breakfast, or dinner, and whether it's vegetarian, non-vegetarian, alcoholic beverages, or non-alcoholic beverages. And keeping data and records on all these types of food and meals and beverages is important to being able to understand the tour's carbon footprint. When you look at an organization's carbon footprint, we need to include business travel. So even if you're not a tour operator or in the aviation sector, keeping data on all of these categories is important to be able to calculate your carbon footprint as an organization. Being able to reduce air travel is becoming more and more valued, and understanding different options through electronic communications such as Zoom or Teams, or whether we can take trains and buses to reduce the amount we fly, is going to be important in the long term. Even though the airline sector has set ambitious targets of net zero by 2050 and are looking at opportunities for renewable and sustainable aviation fuel, it's still a large emission source at the moment. So taking action now and reducing that emissions is going to be key to reducing long-term climate change. So we mentioned data collection earlier. We're going to spend a bit of time on it now because it is very, very important. We break data into two different types. We have primary data and secondary data. Primary data is the actual consumption provided by your company, your suppliers, or your customers, or any other organization relevant to its activities. Examples are liters of fuel used in the vehicles. It's the kilowatt hours of electricity purchased from the grid. It's the tons of waste that go to landfill. Secondary data, we need to use industry averages, national averages, as well as statistics. Examples here are nights in a 4-star hotel, number of meals eaten, And we can also use dollar values spent on certain sectors. So dollars spent on travel. We can understand the emissions factors for each of these different statistics and characteristics and be able to apply and calculate emissions. So both sets of data sources are acceptable to the standard, but we prefer using primary data because it increases the level of accuracy of the accounting. So when we required to collect data, it needs to be provided by the reporting company and preferably collected from staff members with direct access to that relevant data. So depending on who is responsible for that data, it could be the energy manager that you need to talk to for electricity and natural gas. It could be the fleet manager for data on the fleet vehicles and car, petrol and diesel usage. It could be your travel agent or your waste provider to collect data on flights and waste to landfill. So understanding who the key people are within your organization and your supply chain is going to be important to going to collect that data that you need. In our work, we brief the relevant staff, the project manager on the work, to understand and identify those people and help them in communicating the requirements and the need and why they need that data to the data managers. And over time, those conversations become more common, and setting up internal processes and procedures on a regular basis, be it monthly or annually, to provide that data into a central system for recalculations of baselines is important to streamline it over time. I said earlier, nobody starts off with perfect data. So I am yet to do a greenhouse gas account with perfect data from the first go. Often we need to use secondary data and make assumptions and models to be able to calculate the emissions, and that is perfectly fine. There is absolutely no issue with this whatsoever in terms of reporting only using secondary data. However, over time, we want to work towards increasing accuracy, and identifying the primary data sources is going to be important. Now, scope 3 is often the biggest challenge for our clients. Collecting and measuring scope 3 can be very hard and can be very time consuming. And there's different methods to collect this data, whether it's from service providers, your internal data managers, or your suppliers. Examples of service providers are your waste provider, and often you can go and ask them to provide weight of waste and disposal type, whether it goes to landfill, whether it's recycled, or whether it goes to a waste to energy plant, for example. And that's needed to be collated by your waste operations or your operations team. And good ways to include this data collection, if it's not already there, is when contracts are up for renewal. Include that in your clauses and requirements from your suppliers to provide. Similarly, business travel can be found from your finance team, company surveys, or travel agents. And then logistics, such as freight forwarding companies, you can go and talk to them and they will be able to provide you with the information of how much you shipped and where. And if they can't, that's a good time to put in place the process for next year's reporting. Similarly to suppliers, you need to look at the goods that you purchase. So whether we can use actual data, as in kilograms of hand towels, for example, reams of paper, that's a good source of data, or we can use average data. So average amount of waste per employee, for example. We can use spend-based data as well. So you spend so many dollars on this product or service to calculate the emissions. And examples here include services, so data centers. Often people have data centers on site, which is using electricity from the grid, which is a scope 2 emission source. Being able to transfer that onto the cloud removes the scope 2 emission source, but it creates now a scope 3 emission source, which needs to be accounted for. So by calculating your scope 3, you need to go and talk to your data provider, be that Amazon Web Services or Google or whoever it is, and understand their emissions profiles. And alternatively, we need to know the number of users using Microsoft 360 as an example, and we can calculate the emission based on that as well. And then the use of the method is dependent on the data availability and the types of goods evaluated. So sometimes dollar spend is perfectly fine. So other times it would be preferable to get average data. And then your consulting service provider can also assist you in understanding what data you need. So now we're looking at some common challenges. We see these challenges on a, I'd say, weekly basis across our client base, and you are not unique, you're not alone if you experience these challenges. So the first one is data from suppliers is not uniform, it's not available, and it's not able to be provided, often down to poor recording from the supplier. Secondly, the data depth is too low. So many assumptions have to be made to reduce the accounting quality. And then internally, we have multiple data owners, which creates conflict in data assessment and a lot of effort in collecting the data from lots of different people. But there are actions that can be undertaken. So in the first year, it might be very hard to get a decent data set, but then in the second and third year, it should become more easy. And several actions can be taken, such as identifying data storage options and data management across the business and keeping things in a central location. Identifying the details needed for each emission category and giving priority to material emissions. So once you've done the first year's accounting, you know what the important data is. And then therefore you should prioritize collecting that centrally and on a regular basis. And for smaller emission sources, maybe it's not as important to spend the effort in collecting it more accurately. And then focus to get the data, primary data from the supply chain. And then for smaller categories, secondary data as well. So for the big emission sources, prioritize those suppliers which have a material impact on your carbon footprint. In this next section, we're looking at reporting greenhouse gas emissions. So as we covered in session 1, there are 5 main principles in the greenhouse gas accounting protocol. And these need to be applied to reporting as well. So it needs to be relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and accurate. A credible and robust greenhouse gas report presents the information as clearly as possible. While it takes time to develop a rigorous and complete greenhouse gas inventory, understanding and improved knowledge in calculating and reporting the data will only get better over time. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol therefore recommends that a public greenhouse gas report be based on the best available data at the time. So use what data you have and improve that over time is important too, but don't, as we said earlier, don't not take that first step because the data is not available. You need to acknowledge your limitations. So understand which data wasn't available and make efforts to improve it next year. Communicate any identified errors. So when you redo the greenhouse gas accounting and errors were identified or assumptions were wrong previously, update it, acknowledge it, and that's perfectly acceptable. And no one is expecting anybody to be always perfect. And I think this goes to the question earlier, but you need to include your gross emissions separately from any greenhouse gas trades or offsets. So where you purchase carbon credits, you need to report your emissions and your offsets as separate, and also any insetting work that's done as well. Now we've got an example of greenhouse gas report contents page, and some of this is required under the greenhouse gas protocol, and some of this is optional. So the information that is required is a brief description of the company, the reporting period covered, and any major exclusions or sources of operations. So you need to briefly describe your operations, your business, and what time period we're talking about. You need to describe the organizational boundary, what's included in your emissions footprint and your consolidation approach, and then whether you're using an equity share approach, an operational control approach, or a financial control approach. And then whether you include scope 3 or not. You need to describe the calculation methodologies used. And you also need to look back over the last period and track emissions over time from the base year to now. And that allows people to understand if emissions are improving or increasing over time. You need to report, you are required to report your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And you need to report against the 7 different greenhouse gases identified in the previous slides separately. So nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, carbon dioxide, methane, HFCs, and 2 more. Sorry, I can go back. And then the context for any base year recalculations as well. So this is where any assumptions have changed, which change the baseline. That's when you need to recalculate and reassess your baseline. Optional information, so you can choose to include scope 3 emissions, and more so scope 3 emissions are becoming expected to be reported on. It's helpful to break the emissions down by location, be that facility, country, emission source, activity type, just to give your reader an understanding of where the emissions are coming from across your organization. And that helps you set targets, and it helps you identify emission reduction projects. It's helpful to have ratio performance indicators or key performance indicators, such as tons of carbon per employee, tons of carbon per meter squared, tons per carbon product, for example. And then outline the management programs and strategies and any verification statements that you've put into place. And then finally, you need to include any information on improvement projects and on the inventory quality, and identify where uncertainties are and how you're going to improve that. You need to include information on carbon offsetting or carbon sequestration, and then finally, carbon offsets. So that's what needs to be included. Sorry. So that's what needs to be included in a report. And on the next slide, we'll just look at an example contents page. So this is a typical structure for a greenhouse gas report. We start with an executive summary, explaining the results, summarizing the key performance indicators, and identifying any major hotspots. In the introduction, we have a company profile, the methodology used, an overview of the system boundaries and the data inventory. And then finally, the main section is the results. So we summarize the results. We include tables and visualizations of emissions, broken down as much as possible, as I mentioned, facility level, country level, activity level, just to give your reader an understanding of the emission sources. And then recommendations. So this is where we list activities that can be done to improve the data quality for next year or on an ongoing basis. And in the annex, we include the emissions factors that we've referenced, any assumptions, and that's important to include, and any data extrapolations. So where we've noticed, where we've taken assumptions or done modeling to close the data gap, we need to include our assumptions in the report too. So for the last 10 minutes, we're going to look at 3 case studies, and we're going to show you different greenhouse gas profiles and discuss some of the opportunities these companies may have to reduce them. So this first example is from the construction industry. As you can see in this example, the majority of emissions are from scope 3. And they're applied to the steel purchased for the building, the concrete, and the doors and glazing. So the steel is obviously used for structure and the roof. Concrete is used for the structural building as well. And then door glazing are quite important to keep the weather out. So other significant emission sources also come from the fit out internally. Appliances that go into this house. Transportation of materials is important as well, and also the timber products that go in, although they're comparatively smaller. So this shows you that over 50% come from 2 emission sources. So this could be a good opportunity to identify alternative materials or alternative processes to be able to build a lower carbon house. The challenge in this sector is around the embedded emissions of materials. Currently, there is no commercially viable emission reduction option for either of these products. However, the steel sector and the concrete sector are both looking at ways to decarbonize and reduce emissions through the use of green steel and hydrogen in the steel production process and reducing Portland cement in the concrete production. This next example, and you can see we've presented this emission profile in a slightly different format. So we've used a bar chart rather than a donut chart. And here we're looking at the retail industry. Retail is typically high in scope 3 compared to scope 1 and 2. And that's because of the purchased goods and the sold products that go through the retail store, rather than the electricity consumption in the office itself, in the store itself. So depending on the electricity source, the fuel and energy emissions might be high, but in this case, they're relatively low. Depending on the type of business, whether transportation is included and what type of transportation, whether it's flights, whether the product is flown or shipped, or whether it's just local distribution, again, can impact the overall footprint. And depending on the product sold, the processing of sold products or the use of sold products can also be high. For example, if a business sells gas boilers, the emissions through the life of that gas boiler are part of their overall emissions footprint. And being able to identify opportunities to move away from carbon intensive products on your decarbonization journey. The third example, and this again, I think we discussed this earlier, is the financial industry. So the financial industry typically has very low Scope 1 emissions. There's not a lot of natural gas in the building, for example. Scope 2 is also relatively small compared to Scope 3. As I said earlier, the CDP's report in 2021 showed that financial sector financed emissions are on average 700 times greater than its own operation. So the graph we've shown on the right is using a pie chart approach. Again, similar, a different visual representation of the emissions footprint, and it shows something slightly different. So here we can see the operational emissions is the tiny blue slither in the middle of the pie chart of 0.1% of the overall footprint. Financed emissions are 99.9% of the total profile. And of that 0.1%, in this example, electricity is only 2% of 0.1%, and the other major contributors are business travel, commuter travel, and other investments. The finance industry faces a big challenge in decarbonisation because they need to understand and reduce their financed emissions over time. Commuter travel is important to understand. This can often be captured through employee surveys, and reduction opportunities there include incentivization of public transport use or cycling or walking to work, and not driving personal cars. Business travel as well. This is quite a high percentage from business travel, 40% of your operational emissions. So identifying opportunities to reduce that is also going to be important for this business. That was the last slide I had. So I want to thank you very much for your time today, and open the floor to any questions. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks again, Matt, for your very insightful presentation and also the case study. One of the key highlights just now that I noted down is, again, start first, even though your data is not complete, because that's not a unique problem. Everyone also having that kind of challenge. So bagi para peserta, mungkin highlight dari sesi Pak Matt barusan adalah mulai saja dulu, karena walaupun data Anda belum lengkap, karena memang hampir semua perusahaan juga mengalami kendala yang sama. So that's kind of the highlight that also I think the objective of today's session is to, company could just start their journey. So now we'll be moving on to the Q&A session. And again, we have a lot of very interesting questions. First one just now I see on the question, but I accidentally answer it as has been answered. I know you have alluded this as well in your presentation just now on Scope 3. Are the calculation included in Scope 3 based on assumption, or the most ideal will be us suppliers to report in their GHG emission to us and take the data? So I just also want to add just a bit of my question as well, because just now you already mentioned that you should be asking from suppliers and also using assumption, which is from average data, which I see is intensity. Maybe one of the key points also, where can you find the data for the emission factor as well, which will be very important for the companies today. So please go ahead.
Yeah, I think preferably you would want direct data from suppliers. Alternatively, yes, you can use spend data or global averages, fine. We source our emissions factors from various different places. We've got the UK BEIS is a very good source of emissions factors that we use. The IEA has quite a complete data set. We use licensed emissions factors from sources such as EcoInvent, and there's other published emissions factor out there. The Australian government publishes a series of emissions factors every year as well. So there is a lot that is publicly available. Some of it is licensed, so it depends on what sector you're in and what data you're after. But in terms of the averages, they all sort of feed through into the emissions factors themselves. So economists develop these huge models to understand $1 spent on various products equates to a certain tons or kilograms of carbon. So there's a lot of work that goes behind the emissions factors, and we're lucky in the fact that we just get to apply them rather than calculate them themselves.
Okay, thank you, Matt. I just now forget to mention for our participants that we have another session after this. Jadi jangan lupa, saya tadi lupa mengingatkan, kita sekarang Q&A session, tapi jangan lupa setelah ini kita masih ada sesi terakhir yang berupa sharing dari perusahaan. Dalam kasus ini adalah PT Musimas dalam implementasi greenhouse gas accounting mereka, di mana kita bisa belajar bersama mengenai bagaimana perusahaan mengimplementasikan greenhouse gas accounting. Dan sekarang juga saya lihat masih ada waktu yang cukup untuk Q&A, tapi ingin saya ingatkan saja, apabila nanti kita tidak bisa menjawab semua pertanyaan hari ini, nanti pertanyaan-pertanyaan ini akan kami kumpulkan dan akan kami jawab dan akan melanjutkannya dengan Anda setelah kegiatan ini. Jadi baik, saya balik lagi to Q&A session. So I'm going back to Q&A session because just now I forgot to mention something. I also find that there's an interesting question about, I think this one is more on a reporting approach, data collection. I think this one is more on reporting approach because they mentioned about disclosure. So is there an approach that allows a company to gradually disclose emissions? So for example, if they initially have 50 plants, and if to collect the 3-year emission for their entire 50 plants in short of time, it would be costly. So would it be okay for them to, start from their 20 largest plants and gradually increase their scope to include all of their plants? So is this an option? And if it's an option, and how would you do it? But if not, is there any ideal scenario that this kind of company that they should take? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an okay approach. I think it sort of makes sense. I think what you need to avoid is making claims based on limited data. But I think in a greenhouse gas report, if you clearly acknowledge what has been included and what has been included, and then in the recommendation section, put plans into place to collect, say, the next 20 and the next 10. I think that's acceptable. The other option is to collect the data from, say, the top 20 plants, work out an intensity factor and apply an assumption to the remaining 30, just to give yourself an understanding of what the number might be. But again, clearly and transparently, understand what assumptions and methodologies you've applied, just so that people don't think that that's the full answer. But I think that approach is perfectly fine.
Thank you, Matt. So basically, you just have to make sure that you could apply the intensity of those top 20 plans, and then use it on your other plans. But again,
it's an option.
Yeah, it's an option again. But your highlight was
just to give you an idea.
Yeah. But the highlight
it might be wrong.
Yeah, so. Yeah. It has to be transparent, and you have to state it in your report. So. I'm going to the next question because this one is interesting, because I don't think this was mentioned in your report, in your presentation just now. It's about governance. So would you, dear Matt, would appreciate if you could share any best practices on the governance of GHG reporting? Is there any specific committee that leadership in the committee that is required for reporting? So yeah, please go ahead, Matt.
Maybe just take a step back and just look at the TCFD guidelines on governance as well. They've got very good recommendations on who should be responsible for climate risk in general, but within that greenhouse gas accounting, I think ultimately it's the CEO is ultimately responsible for all of this. But certainly I think that, yeah, an internal committee is going to be important. It depends on the business and what works for the business. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules that you have to follow this approach, as long as it's kind of done and people are responsible. Often there's we're seeing more and more CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers in businesses, who are going to be responsible for this thing, for reporting. But yeah, I'd just take a look at the governance recommendations within TCFD.
Yep. So just a quick reminder that we also had a TCFD session before.
Right.
So bagi para peserta yang tertarik untuk melihat rekamannya, nanti juga rekamannya itu ada di share oleh IDX, dan nanti juga di materi kita juga akan memberikan link ke webinar-webinar sebelumnya yang salah satunya membahas tentang TCFD dan juga peran tata kelola atau governance of climate change reporting pada webinar tersebut, dan juga mengenai TCFD. Nanti juga kita ada bahan mengenai TCFD yang sudah kita translasikan ke dalam bahasa Indonesia. Okay, now we're going to the next question. So again, there's still a lot of questions. Again, I think this one is also quite interesting for reporting boundary. So just now you mentioned about equity approach. In regards to reporting boundary, is it possible to combine controlling and equity approach? So for example, company only reports emission from organization it controls, and calculates emission based on equity in those organizations.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think as long as the methodology is consistent and clear, then I think, yeah, the difference between calculating and reporting, I think it's fine. If that's useful, then I think take all the methodologies and apply them that in the way that meets your needs.
Yep. Okay, so I think this one is also more of a practical question as well. Can you suggest on where companies can see examples or guidelines to make GHG report? I know you mentioned just now a bit on your presentation, but do you have any other insights as well that company could refer to on how they could make, and also the example on how they report on GHG report?
So there's a few reporting platforms. I think a lot of people report on their own company websites. Obviously, another source of reporting is things like CDP. and TCFD reports now more and more have greenhouse gas reporting sections. The Australian Standard Climate Active requires a short disclosure statement, two or three pages, so not very detailed. There's probably no single repository for all greenhouse gas reports, and I think most people also include them in their sustainability reports as well, as a section of a broader sustainability report. So yeah, I think just Google the company that you're interested in and see if you can track down the sustainability report. It's probably a good first place to look.
Yeah. Interesting to mention on sustainability report and CDP, because for sustainability report we also have GRI here, and which I think company could also refer to their sustainability report, which use the GRI framework, and also for CDP. So companies could also report to CDP, in which if they made it public, companies could also see how companies that you want to see on how they report their GHG emissions. So that's an interesting question for CDP as well, and also for GRI. We still have a question again on carbon offsetting and carbon insetting. Can you help clarify again what's the difference between carbon offset and also carbon inset?
So carbon insetting is a project within your supply chain to remove and reduce carbon. So they have to be within your supply chain, and they don't necessarily have to create carbon certificates. The carbon offset is typically a project that's developed by a third party outside your supply chain, creates a certificate that is certified under a certification standard such as Vera or Gold Standard, and it becomes a tradable commodity. So you can now trade the certificate either through a compliance market or a voluntary market, and then it's retired against the register, either the Vera register or the Gold Standard register, for example, and then that becomes a carbon offset. So they are similar in their sort of application, but they're different in terms of the actual process to create them. I guess the benefit of offsets is that they are audited and verified, whereas insetting is not always as robustly verified. But insetting also has the advantages of supporting companies and people within your value chain. So there is benefits to both, I think.
Thank you for the carbon offsetting and insetting. So carbon inset mainly is on your own supply chain, while carbon offset, you have to certify it and then you could sell it on the market. Okay.
Correct.
I think I have an interesting question as well that I just want to briefly touch upon, because it also relates to CDP. Dear Matt, what are the good application system available in the market that can help company to store, calculate, and report the GHG? So I just want to brief touch upon this. So CDP companies could also report their company could store, report, and calculate their GHG emission in CDP, because that's what CDP is about. CDP reporting, GHG reporting in CDP, which you also have the guidelines on how to report those numbers, how to collect those numbers. So that's a bit of from CDP, but please feel free to add something more, Matt, on this.
Yeah, this is timely. We've just done some research about what applications are out there. We found about 33 different platforms. So there is a wide range of, and I'm sure we've missed many more, but we found quite a lot, and they range from being able to account from your full supply chain emissions, every emissions factor, every emissions source, you name it, it's covered, down to just applicable to small businesses, just scope 1, 2 business travel. So it depends on the application and the cost that you're willing to spend, because they range so much. So it's probably hard to comment what is good without understanding a little bit more about your needs. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I think that concludes our session right now. We still have a lot of questions, but for the other side question, we will kind of highlight it after the event. So again, thank you, Matt. That was a very insightful presentation, and thank you for answering lots of questions in relates to specific details and also how to implement GHG emission. And please don't forget the key highlight of Matt. The key message from Matt is, again, just start first. Don't worry about incomplete data, because that's the challenge that everyone's having. So thank you again, Matt. If you have any last message or something that you want to convey to our audience today.
I just want to thank GRI and CDP for the opportunity to present today. And yeah, I wish all the participants and attendees the best of luck on starting their climate journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Baik, jadi melanjutkan pelatihan dari Mr. Matt mengenai greenhouse gas accounting. Sekarang kita akan melanjutkan dengan pemaparan dari Bapak Olivier Tichit dari PT Musimas untuk mempelajari praktik langsung dari perusahaan serta mengetahui bagaimana pendekatan PT Musimas dalam greenhouse gas accounting. Jadi sedikit tentang Pak Olivier. Pak Olivier ini merupakan Director of Sustainable Supply Chain dari PT Musimas yang merupakan perusahaan minyak sawit dengan skala global dan merupakan salah satu yang memimpin dalam perihal keberlanjutan. Pak Olivier ini terlibat aktif dalam RSPO atau Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil dan merupakan salah satu anggota dari Board of Governors yang mewakili perusahaan, prosesor, trader, dan juga merupakan anggota komite untuk standar RSPO. Pak Olivier ini merupakan ahli agronomi, dan sebelum bergabung dengan Musimas, Pak Olivier merupakan Group Head of Sustainability and Commercial Director dari CPEF, yang merupakan perusahaan perkebunan asal Belgia yang memiliki bisnis di Pantai Gading, Indonesia, dan Papua Nugini. Jadi mari kita undang langsung Pak Olivier Tichit untuk membawakan materinya. So we are pleased to be joined by Bapak Olivier today. I've briefly introduced about your bio, and without further delay, I'll hand it over to you, Pak Olivier. So thank you.
Terima kasih, Mas Wisnu. Selamat pagi atau sebenarnya selamat siang dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Saya akan lanjut dalam bahasa Inggris ya, karena hari ini materinya dalam bahasa Inggris. So thank you very much for inviting me today, for inviting Musimas today to share our experience on GHG emissions calculation. So you've already presented Musimas, so I won't go further. Can somebody put up my presentation on screen, if you please? I'm
just 1 second.
Still technology challenged. I'm always worried of hitting the wrong button. So I'll just say one quick thing about PT Musimas. So PT Musimas, we're integrated indeed. We go from plantations to transformation of the products. That will be of interest to us today. And the company was founded in 1932, actually. So it's a very old company. Next, if you please. Let's see if yeah, sorry, you'll have to help me, because apparently I can't see the little button. Thank you. So this slide is here to show our activities. And as you can see, and for those who know the industry, palm, it can be a long processing chain, a long supply chain, all the way from upstream, the plantations, to downstream, what we call value added. There might be cooking oil, it might be soaps, it might be some more complicated products. So we are, most of the time as Musimas, we're not even the final actor. So a good part of our production goes on to manufacturers, brands. They use our products as raw material for their own products. So they also expect us to share our emissions measurements with them, so they also can calculate their emissions. Next. Thank you. So Musimas has a sustainability policy, which we have updated in 2020, and it has 4 pillars: improving livelihoods, first pillar; second pillar, positive environmental impacts; the third pillar is about enduring, so long-lasting relationships with our suppliers, with our customers, and with other stakeholders. And the fourth pillar is about innovation in sustainability. These include which are related to climate and logically to emissions. Next. So we'll look at some of these of the elements a bit more in detail. So first, a clear target, reducing the GHG emissions and intensity of our RSPO certified mills by 55% by 2025. This is expressed in metric tons of equivalent CO2 per metric ton of CPO and using a 2006 baseline. And this covers our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. I've tried to follow what Matt said earlier about defining the scope, and you have to say clearly what you are doing. So where are we today? Today, we are about at 47% reduction, at least at the end of 2020. And on the scope, I want to be clear that this is the scope of this target, but our reporting is on a much broader scope. It looks at all our operations. So what else do we do that is related to emissions and GHG? We conduct workshops internally, but also for our suppliers to introduce, to maintain, and to constantly improve the understanding of the importance of sustainability and how you can implement it. Third thing that's related, and that's included in our policy, research and development of approaches to reduce emissions, and in particular, what we do around waste. And that leads me to another concrete commitment, which is capture methane. Why capture methane? Because it is what Matt called earlier a hotspot. The effluent from the mills, the palm oil mills, it needs treatment, and that treatment, during that treatment, there's a lot of methane that can be released. So we at Mosimas have decided to equip our mills with methane capture facilities and even to produce electricity with the biogas instead of flaring it, which is already better than releasing it in the atmosphere. So we have, over the years, we have captured or we have avoided about 500,000 tons of CO2 equivalent from 15 mills out of our 16 mills at the time that have been equipped with methane capture facilities. Following item is forecast, analyze, decide. Why? By using GHG measurement tools, we can make different scenarios on savings. And so we can study the best approach for our operations. For example, on fertilizer. So which fertilizer is the one that will yield the lowest emissions, and at the same time that will still give us a good yield of fruit. Also, it means that we can analyze, we can change, we can even cancel projects because of the emissions that we can forecast. So we can make decisions about the business using thinking and trying to figure out what is going to be the emissions, what are going to be the emissions, what is going to be the impact of a project, not only financially for the business, but also in terms of emissions. And the last point I wanted to show is to report and verify. So calculating our emissions is good, reporting them is better. It's a matter of transparency, that's a positive value, but verifying is even better. And verifying, that means using something that we also do. It requires a bit of work. I think that's going to be a constant theme. Next slide, please. So how do we calculate? Matt has mentioned earlier about the GHG protocol. That is indeed the basis. But from a user point of view, our issue is that there are multiple methods and calculators which are required of us. Some by law, let's say ISPO, some, so the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Standard, which has its own calculator. Some are voluntary. For example, for us, we are RSPO certified, so we use also the RSPO calculator. Some also voluntary to comply with other countries' regulations, like why? Because when we want to participate, we need to comply with the regulations in the country, in the market country. So we go back again to that theme. It takes a team, it takes a bit of work. Next slide, please. So why do we do it? Why does a company go into all this effort? Again, I think Matt has made a few points about that. It can be a matter of legal compliance. So let's say ISPO in Indonesia, but before there was ISPO, we had started calculating our GHG emissions as well. So why do we do that? We plan better what we wanted to do in terms of reductions of impacts better. But also we have been able to the evidence to our stakeholders of emissions and how we are reducing them, and in particular our customers. So they want to see a reduction in emissions, their markets want to see reductions in emissions, we want to participate to that, we show that to our customers, it creates a better relationship, it gives us better market access. Also, we have to think future, we have to be ready for upcoming more regulations, more laws that will introduce carbon tax, that will introduce possibly mandatory reductions in our emissions as well. So we have to be ready. It's a process, it's a constant process. And it is indeed a lot of work. So next slide, please. What are the challenges? So you can see here the 3 points are all about data. And I think, again, Matt has mentioned a lot about data as well. So do not be afraid. I agree with what Matt has mentioned earlier, which is give it a start. You have to start. Once you get into it, you will see that it's not insurmountable, it's not impossible, but it is indeed a lot of work. Data collection, so that's the first and most important part. So it has to be organized, even if it's not perfect. Why? Because if it's disorganized, it can be very frustrating for everybody, for the people collecting and for the people who are requested the information. The more you go to your colleagues and you say, why, oh, sorry, I forgot that bit. Oh, sorry, I looked back and I think I would like an extra information. It doesn't make anybody happy, and it's not the most efficient of processes. So plan. If it's imperfect, that's fine. But try to have a good plan. It's better. The second point is the quality of the data. That's obviously important. Again, good preparation is critical to make sure everybody knows what you will want, in what format you will want, when you will want it, covering the right period in the right unit. Finally, and it might sound like a solution, to have a centralized database or a centralized control of the data. Even if you have automated data exchange, so let's say if the data is automatically captured from the operations, you still need to ensure that it will go in the right place at the right time, that it will be analyzed correctly, and you will still need some control. Errors happen, data gets corrupted, it happens. It's not the end of the world. You might have to discard some information, you might have to ask for new information, that's fine, but that role of centralized collection of the information, planning, and then collection and control of the information before you can even go to the reporting, that function. It takes time, like I said, it takes work, it takes a team. Practically, so far we've been a bit theoretical. So what does it mean? So for us, let's say it takes us about 3 to 4 months, even though it's already a regular 3 to 4 months to make sure that we have collected, that we have asked the right people, that everybody has been returning the information correctly or inputting correctly the information in the system, and to check the data across all our operations. Like I said, it's not a new exercise, and yet every year we need to plan for that kind of cycle, about 3 months to from 3 to 4 months. That's a challenge. That's something we have to be ready for. We have the team, we have trained our people, they've gained experience. It's important to know that you can start at a lower level, but you have to prepare that it will become more and more work. It's a fact, but it's very useful information. Next slide, please. And that will be my final slide. We're not going to go through point by point, but the point is what comes next. And as you could see from the previous presentations, Scope 3 is the big thing for every company. if you are buying products from others, which is our case as well, we refine oil that we buy from others. Our scope 3 is really important, and there are also externalities. So we are working on our scope 3 very actively. It's not something we did from the first day. We learned to master scopes 1 and 2. How do we report? What do we want? When do we move on to scope 3? And so we've been working on our scope 3, and we're planning on starting issuing numbers beginning next year. So that will change a lot the way the emissions will be shown. I think, like Matt has presented, scope 3 can represent a large set of emissions, a large volume of emissions. So it's something that has to be well understood as well. And that's something which for us is sometimes a bit worrying. How are the stakeholders going to understand? Is the scope 3 going to appear very big to them? Or is everybody going to realize that this is about transparency, about trying to account and trying to find together what are the solutions? What can we do? What others can do? How can we show our suppliers what is their share of our emissions? How can we motivate them, help them to reduce in turn their emissions? All this is good intentions. It's only made possible if we have good data, good reporting, and if everybody gets on board and starts reporting and starts considering their emissions. That's, I think, as we know, and Matt earlier said it, yes, start reporting. It's work, it's not impossible, and it's a way forward. It's the way forward. We have to start being transparent. What do we have to hide? We have to start being transparent and assess and move on to reducing our emissions. And that's it for me today. I hope it was clear and useful to everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pa Olivier, for your very insightful presentation. We really appreciate that you take your time to share with us today. Jadi dari presentasi Pak Olivier tadi dapat kita simpulkan ada 3 alasan utama untuk melakukan GHG accounting, yakni 1 kredibilitas, 2 akses pasar, dan 3 yakni untuk mempersiapkan perusahaan di masa depan ketika baik ini nanti ada transisi menuju ekonomi rendah karbon. Selain itu, pesan dari Pak Olivier juga sama dengan Pak Matt, yakni memang masih terdapat beberapa tantangan terkait pengumpulan data GHG, tapi pesannya tetap sama, mulai terlebih dahulu agar kita mengerti data apa yang kurang dan mengerti dari mana kita harus memulai. Jadi sekali lagi terima kasih Pak Olivier untuk presentasinya. Any final pesan-pesan akhir untuk audiens kita hari ini?
Saya kira sudah cukup seperti kita diskusi bersama. Saya kira yang penting adalah harus mulai, harus berani mulai. Tidak ada sesuatu, harus berani mulai. Ini ekonomi yang sekarang, kita harus pikir masa depan. Usaha kita harus mulai.
Betul. Jadi seperti poin 3 tadi ya Pak, mempersiapkan untuk masa depan. Baik, jadi itu dari Pak Olivier Tichit. Terima kasih banyak Pak. Dan juga dari saya, jadi ini merupakan sesi akhir dari webinar hari ini. Sekali lagi, saya ingin berterima kasih banyak kepada pembicara dan juga peserta yang sudah berpartisipasi pada webinar hari ini. Tapi sebelum Anda meninggalkan ruangan ini, saya akan sangat mengapresiasi apabila Anda dapat meluangkan waktu Anda, itu sekitar 5 menit saja untuk mengisi survei mengenai feedback Anda atau umpan balik Anda untuk sesi di hari ini. Ini tentu saja dapat sangat membantu kami untuk terus meningkatkan kualitas materi kami, serta untuk kami untuk mengembangkan webinar-webinar berikutnya. Jadi, silakan untuk menggunakan link yang ada di layar Anda, atau Anda juga dapat mengaksesnya melalui QR Code yang terdapat pada slide ini. Ini saya juga lihat Anda juga dapat mengaksesnya melalui link yang kami sediakan di chat box untuk dapat mengakses survei ini. Jadi sekali lagi, masukan dari Anda akan sangat berharga bagi kami, jadi kami akan sangat mengapresiasi masukan-masukan yang Anda berikan melalui survei ini. Dan saya yakin beberapa dari Anda juga sudah mengisi survei yang serupa di sesi GRI kemarin. Tapi untuk hari ini, pada form surveinya silahkan untuk memilih multi-country dan juga CDP worldwide sebagai pelaksananya. Jadi silahkan pilih Advanced Workshop sebagai nama dari pelatihan hari ini. Dan sebelum nanti setelah Anda mengisi itu, Anda dapat melanjutkan ke pertanyaan-pertanyaan survei yang lain. Jadi baik, akan saya tunggu sejenak supaya para peserta bisa mulai mengakses survei ini sebelum saya tutup acara ini. Jadi silakan Anda dapat menggunakan QR Code ataupun Anda dapat langsung mengklik link yang terdapat pada chat box. Jadi baik, sebelum saya menutup kegiatan hari ini, saya juga ingin mengingatkan bahwa nanti pada 1 Desember kami akan mengadakan sesi lokal karya terakhir kami, webinar kami dalam proyek ini, yakni dengan tema Sustainable Finance atau keuangan berkelanjutan. Kami berharap agar dapat bertemu dengan Anda lagi di webinar mengenai Sustainable Finance ini, dan nanti undangannya juga akan dikirim oleh mitra kami, GRI dan juga IDX. Baiklah, sekian dari kami untuk sesi webinar hari ini. Sekali lagi, terima kasih untuk pembicara serta untuk peserta yang sudah ikut serta pada sesi hari ini. Saya berharap bahwa sesi yang kami siapkan di hari ini dapat bermanfaat bagi Anda dan juga bagi perusahaan Anda. Baik, saya tutup saja acaranya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang, salam sejahtera, dan sehat selalu. Sampai jumpa.